This is a walkthrough of Underlayered Suspicion, a review of CRA audits of Muslim-led charities. In this walkthrough, we'll take you through the case study on the Ottawa Islamic Center and Assalam Mosque. Now, a little bit of history is in order. The Ottawa Islamic Center applied for charitable status in 2003. Before it was registered, it went through two pre-registration audits before the CRA and the Charities Directorate granted it charitable status. These two pre-registration audits were somewhat unusual and fairly inquisitive about the nature of what would be going on at the Ottawa Islamic Center. You can imagine in 2003, after, 2 years into the war on terror, people are focusing on Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda. The fact that the Ottawa Islamic Center caters to Ottawa's very large Somali Muslim community ought not be irrelevant to our analysis here, though that feature doesn't appear at all in any of the documentation that we saw from the CRA or Charities Directorate. There was no indication of the racial or ethnic or national dimension of those who would attend the mosque. It was racially flat in that context. Now, what's important is the Ottawa Islamic Center case fronts a very specific issue in charities law. A charity can qualify for charitable status if it fulfills a series of purposes. There's key purposes that are involved. One is, for instance, the advancing of religion, which is the one that the Ottawa Islamic Center sought to do. Another is the advancing of education. Many universities, for instance, are charitable organizations that advance religion, or just more generally the public benefit. And when an organization falls under one of those categories, it's presumed it fulfills a certain presumption of therefore satisfying the common law requirement of charitable status. However, even if it does, let's say, purport to advance religion, there's a second feature of what's called the public benefit test, which could come in and say, you may say you're advancing religion and you may benefit from the presumption that you do so. But if we can find evidence that you are violating the public benefit in this other way, then the presumption that you're fulfilling charitable purposes bursts, and we can then investigate. And so the Charities Directorate explains this public benefit test as follows. So the first part, of course, requires that a tangible or objectively measurable socially useful benefit be conferred. So for instance, advancing religion. But the second part of the test, which is where we are in this particular case study, is it requires that the benefit be directed to the public or a sufficient section of the public. This means a charity cannot have an eligible beneficiary group that is negligible in size or restrict eligible beneficiaries based on criteria that are not justified by its charitable purposes and provide an unacceptable private benefit. Now, the first part, of course, is satisfied, as I indicated, if it fulfills one of the first sort of one of the four common law categories, like advancing religion. But the second part of this test could be called into question, and this is where the Charities Directorate states expressly, where there is evidence to suggest that the activities an organization undertakes to achieve its purposes and thereby ostensibly deliver the required benefit may cause detriment or harm, including activities that promote or incite intolerance, hatred, or violence, pose a significant risk of harm or physical or mental harm to a person, unlawfully restrict human rights and freedoms, or are contrary to Canadian law. So this is a fairly abstract test. It's a fairly open-ended test. And it's the wedge by which, it's a test that creates a wedge for Canada's anti-radicalization policies to seep in to the Ottawa Islamic Center analysis. Now, what was interesting about this particular audit was that the Charities Directorate included an analysis of speakers that had come to the Ottawa Islamic Center. Now, let's be really clear. They have no transcripts, records, or notes of what those speakers said at the Ottawa Islamic Center. There is no indication that there were any records kept by the Ottawa Islamic Center of what those speakers said. However, these four speakers, Abu Usama al-Thahabi, a Black Muslim convert from the United States, who's an imam in the UK, Abu Amina Bilal Phillips, um, an imam, another Black Muslim religious cleric here in Canada, Abdul Hakim Quick, a Black Muslim Canadian here based in Toronto, and Syed Rage, a Somali Black Muslim Canadian, also here in the GTA. These were the four people they identified. And they said, well, these four people said things in different countries, in different institutions, and those things were suspect to them. They said that that fact, what they said in those other places indicated that there is a mere possibility that the views of the speakers could have been expressed here at the Ottawa Islamic Center. And so the fact that they may have said things elsewhere years ago created the concern for the CRA about whether or not the Ottawa Islamic Center violated the public benefit test. Now let's be really clear, these four men, which the audit doesn't really identify who they are too much, but let's be really clear about who they are. They're four Black men who are clerics within the Islamic tradition speaking to Muslim communities. Some of them channel Black radicalism and critical race studies when it comes to thinking about issues of justice. Others speak in a much more Canadian parlance around things. But when you look at what the Canadian government, what the CRA was concerned about when it looked at their speeches from other locations at other times, we broke it down into a typology. That typology is here. That they were concerned that these speakers engaged in forms of misogyny, homophobia, and intolerance. Fine. So let's use this typology. We're not here to suggest that that's true in any way of the four men, but what our concern is that if this is the typology of public benefit, is the Charities Directorate applying it equally to all religious groups? The fact is that these three values do occur, and they do occur in various contexts, in various communities on the political spectrum, whether it's evangelical Christians or right-wing groups or others, some of whom we are parts of, some of whom might be part of our day-to-day observations. The fact is, we're not here to talk about whether or not any particular given belief expressed by the four clerics have a pedigree in the Islamic tradition. Rather, our argument is that these ideas that the CRA is concerned about, misogyny, homophobia, intolerance, these are ideas that fall along a spectrum of what might be called conservative religious beliefs. Conservative religious beliefs or ideas operate across a spectrum of religious and ideological traditions, groups, and organizations. What's important is that many beliefs that fit this taxonomy of misogyny, homophobia, and intolerance are sponsored, featured, or otherwise given a voice in a wide range of charities currently registered with the CRA. The connection the Charities Directorate drew in the Ottawa Islamic Center audit between the foreign speeches of four Black men and the possibility of extremist or radicalized speech raises the question of whether all such conservative speech is incongruous with public benefit. Or rather, is it that some conservatives are free to express conservative beliefs, but other conservatives are not, at least not without coming under the radar of national security. So let's take a look at a couple of these organizations that are currently registered with the CRA, but which sponsor beliefs that might be misogynistic, homophobic, or intolerant. So Christ Forgiveness Ministries, there's multiple media accounts of how in 2019, pastors from Christ Forgiveness Ministry were arrested in Toronto while preaching anti-gay ideas during Pride Week. But Christ Forgiveness Ministries, at the time that we wrote the report, remained a registered charity at the CRA. Canada Christian College's president, Charles McVitie, is no stranger to controversy over conservative ideas that fall within this typology of intolerance, particularly homophobia and intolerance. So, for instance, Christian broadcaster, Christian television service, removed McVitie's show Word TV after Canada's broadcast industry watchdog ruled that various statements by McVitie violated its broadcast codes. McVitie made statements, disparaging statements on topics ranging from homosexuality, Islam and Muslims, Haiti, and so on. On homosexuality, McVitie characterized pride parades as little more than sex parades, and the LGBT community as sexually perverse. The CBSC found that McVitie not only made a series of factually incorrect statements on air about the LGBTQ community, but also mischaracterized them in a manner that was at times excessive, inappropriate, disparaging, and abusive. And so Michael Korn most recently remarked that McVitie has led many of the most unpleasant campaigns in Canada against LGBT equality and modern sex education. He also has radical opinions about other faiths, once stating that Islam is not just a religion, it's a political and cultural system as well. And we know that Christians and Jews and Hindus don't have the same mandate for a hostile takeover. Now, it sounds to us that these kinds of statements fall within the typology, if we go back, of homophobia, but certainly Islamophobia as a form of intolerance. But nonetheless, Canadian Christian College, which employs Mr. McVitie, remains a CRA registered charity. We provide a number of examples here, many of which, like for instance, the Canadians for the Rule of Law, raise questions about whether or not individuals who are known for their positions, for instance, in this case, Christine Douglas Williams, board member of Canadians for the Rule of Law, was actually let go from her position on the Canada Race Relations for her position on Islam and Muslims in particular. Nonetheless, she was a featured speaker at Canadians for the Rule of Law at a very controversial conference, and Canadians for the Rule of Law remains a registered charity. So the real question that the Ottawa Islamic Center case forces us to ask is, who can be conservative? Now, I myself don't identify with conservative values as an author of the report, just in the interest of full disclosure. But nonetheless, if we're going to live under the auspices of a charter that guarantees equality and freedom of belief, freedom of expression, religious belief, and so on, in a context like in Canada, where we do have religious traditions across the spectrum that are conservative, are we willing to render those conservative views all extreme forms of speech that then fall under the rubric of national security and counter-radicalization? Or are we only going to focus just on one? The more Muslim groups are targeted by this anti-radicalization policy and its operationalization, the more it seems that Canada's national strategy on radicalization is embedded with structural bias as well. And that's the big concern coming out of the Ottawa Islamic Center case. Thank you for watching.